Welcome, everybody. My name is Thanos Bostanis. I'm a lecturer here at the Tizard Centre at the University of Kent, where we have two ABAI verified courses in Applied Behaviour Analysis and Positive Behaviour Support, postgraduate courses, obviously. And we also have a PhD. We offer PhD supervision for people working in the field of learning disabilities, behavior analysis, positive behavior support, and so on. I'm going to drop the Tizard Center's website in the chat box for everybody, although I know that most of you are probably familiar with it anyway. Just to draw your attention to our journal, we've got a Tizard Learning Disability Review, which is a peer-reviewed journal, and we are very keen to receive submissions around the field of learning disabilities, service issues, and we are of course welcoming submissions around behavior analysis, PBS, or RFT, which is the topic we're going to be discussing today. So I'm going to share that link as well in the chat, so you can check out the journal for those of you who might be interested. Now, CEUs. I'm gonna interrupt Teresa at 3 points during the presentation, and I'm gonna give you keywords. You should email me all 3 keywords not later than the end of the week, please, okay? If you are requiring CPD units instead, just let me know and I will prepare a separate certificate for you guys. Now, keep in mind that we have about 45 days to issue the certificates, so don't worry if it takes a while, but I always aim to do them before the next journal club. So you should hopefully have them by then. Okay, enough of me talking about the Tizard Center. I am welcoming Dr. Mulhern today here with us. She's a very active RFT person. I've been following her on Twitter. I've been checking out her publications. She's very research active as well. And I'm really, really thrilled you're joining us today, Teresa. It's such a pleasure. Thank you again for that. Before you get started with your presentation, obviously we've got an idea of your bio and your background from the flyer, but could you just tell us what you're working on currently in terms of your research? And then you take it forward and you do your presentation, and I will be around delivering the keywords and supporting with the chat and everything. Okay?
Yeah, perfect. So actually at the moment, my primary focus is on writing a book on relational frame theory, and I'm attempting to simplify it for practitioners and for students. So that is currently in the works with Springer, and it should be out in the next couple of months. So that's currently what I'm doing. So I expect it to be part of your curriculum at some point.
You will, of course you will. And, you know, sign me up for simplifying RFT. I'm not going to pretend I know much about it. So, you know, newbie here. So just, you know, teach us what it's all about.
Happily, lots of cat metaphors though, I'm afraid, so it's something that people just have to sign up to, just accept it as it is. Other than that, I have a couple of different things in the works in links to using acceptance and commitment therapy with individuals working in practice to decrease instances of burnout. So I'm working on that with a former student of mine. So there's a few different things currently happening. But if anyone is kind of familiar with my research profile, you'll kind of notice I've done an awful lot of stuff on relational frame theory. My handle on Twitter is RFTGal. So that's kind of where my love lies. So it kind of made sense that I was going to bring up a paper that is all on RFT, and it's very, very recent. It was just published in 2021, so in the last couple of months. And I know the researchers quite well, so I've been kind of keeping an eye on this before it was even published. So I think it was a good paper to choose. So if you want, I can start off now rather than having much more of a vamp. Fantastic.
Go for it.
Okay, bear with me now because I'm not 100% used to using Zoom for this sort of thing, but we'll get to it. It'll be fine. So the paper that we're looking at is by Elle Kirsten and Ian Stewart. So Elle is a PhD student in NUIG. She is undertaking the ABA program there. She is a board certified behavior analyst and is actually working with Fit Learning Centre in New York. So if you know Fit Learning, you know that they use an awful lot of precision teaching, but that is all based on relational frame theory. And that's part of where her PhD work has come into, and that is assessing the development of relational framing in young children. And I thought this was a really important point for us because RFT research is obviously burgeoning, and we need to really understand what the normative development of these particular skills are rather than just arbitrarily going in and training these particular skills. So what we're going to hopefully achieve today is have a little bit of an overview of exactly what relational frame theory is, have a little link into the previous research on this. We're going to look at the methods of this particular study, the results, and the discussion. Now, it is quite a meaty paper. There's a lot to it. So hopefully we can get to as much of it as possible. So if you've looked at relational frame theory, the general consensus is it's a contextual behavioral account of human language and cognition, which sounds like quite a mouthful. But the way of basically looking at that is relational frame theory views our thought patterns and our language to be patterns of behavior that we can teach via contextual cues. So it's very much an extension of Skinner's, Mann's, Tax, etc. But it's just that little step forward, really kind of pointing out to Chomsky that yes, we can come up with some generative language here. Thank you very much. So it conceptualizes it in terms of arbitrarily applicable derived relational responding, which is a big mouthful, and non-arbitrarily applicable relational responding. So I'm just going to call it AADRR and NAARR because frankly, my tongue isn't able to get around those words that well. But AADRR is essentially when the relationship between two stimuli is based upon very abstract contingencies, or we cannot physically see the relationship between these particular things. So if I said to you that I have come across a new animal and its name is a Zlorb, and I told you that a Zlorb is like a dog, you've never come across a Zlorb, but you already have some ideas as to some of the characteristics that it may have. Why? Because of the contextual cue of Leica and the stimulus that you know already, dog. So that's arbitrarily applicable derived relational responding. That's when we are relating stimuli that we've never actually seen. It's very abstract. And then,
Teresa,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt. It might have been only me, but you froze for a few seconds while you were explaining your example. Could you just in case just repeat it quickly, just in case
absolutely.
you froze for everybody, just so we can follow your thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So if I found a random animal, brand new animal, because I'm interested in finding animals, and I've called it a Zlorb, and I tell you a Zlorb is like a dog. You've never seen a Zlorb, but already you may be getting some idea as to what it may look like, some of its characteristics. If you have a phobia of dogs, you may now think, oh God, I don't want a Zlorb anywhere near me. If you are also an animal dog lover like myself, you're probably like, I'd love to see a Zlorb and give it a cuddle. You now have all of these feelings and thoughts around this abstract thing that you have never seen or had any sort of a relationship with. Importantly, we haven't gotten any reinforcement. There's been no behavioral history there. But because of the link between this stimulus and an existing stimulus that you know, and the contextual cue of Leica, we are now able to answer a lot of questions around what is a Zlorb? What does it look like? Does it have fur? Does it have a tongue? So this is what arbitrarily applicable derived relational responding is. It's all around abstract stimuli that we haven't actually had any sort of exposure to. So that's really higher level language. And then on the lower end is non-arbitrarily applicable relational responding. No, we can't discount that and say, oh, that isn't important, because this is actually the foundation of that really higher abstract thinking. Because even if we think about how we are as practitioners, when we do a match to sample task with kids and we have them match a yellow circle to a yellow circle, and we say, find something that is the same, that's non-arbitrarily applicable relational responding. We are matching things or understanding the relationship between these things based upon the formal characteristics, in the same way that we know that one thing is bigger than the other one based upon the size that we see. We know that 4 cookies is more than 1 cookie, so we want to get those 4 cookies. That is essentially what RFT is. It's understanding the difference between that arbitrary stuff and the non-arbitrary stuff. And then the other 3 little things that you have to remember is that there are lots and lots of frames. I talked about sameness, I talked about some difference, opposition, etc. And even though there are lots of different frames, they all have these 3 particular characteristics. And once you know these, you're flying, you're doing really well. So the first of these is mutual entailment, and that is basically a relationship between 2 stimuli. And if you are very familiar with stimulus equivalence, you'll look at that and kind of think, oh, that's kind of talking about equivalence relationships, and there's a certain amount of symmetry in there. So mutual entailment is just talking about being able to understand a relationship between A and B and being able to derive. So if I tell you that A is bigger than B, you can then derive that B is smaller than A. So mutual entailment is just a relationship between 2 stimuli. And again, if you have any understanding of stimulus equivalence, you're thinking, have they done the classic undergraduate thing of just changing some words around to try and get past Turnitin and not get plagiarized? But no, there is something to it, I promise. And then combinatorial entailment is simply combining those mutually entailed relationships. So this is where we're talking about 3 or more stimuli. So when we're saying that a mouse is smaller than an elephant and an elephant is smaller than a meteor, we can then derive that a mouse is smaller than a meteor and a meteor is bigger than a mouse. So we have derived those particular things, even though we haven't been explicitly taught those things. So that's a relationship between 3 things. But what's really interesting about RFT is the final part. It's the transformation of stimulus function. And I kind of hinted at that earlier when I was talking about my Zlorb example of a Zlorb being like a dog. And that if you had a phobia of dogs and I told you a Zlorb is like a dog, you may feel nervous if I told you a Zlorb is in the next room, which would be kind of miraculous considering this is an online talk and I don't have the means to put a dog into each of your homes. I wish I did, but I don't. So transformation of stimulus function is changing our feelings or our behaviors or even things like our motivating operations towards these particular stimuli. That's essentially it. So once you understand all of those components, that is essentially the entirety of RFT. You don't need to buy my book, that's it. But we would say that relational frames are generalized operants, and quite handily, they can be established via multiple exemplar training. And for us as behavior analysts, that's really important. You know, we go back to Bear, Wolf, and Risley, and we want to make sure that what we are doing is functional, that it's applied. And relational frame theory, when you consider that it may be the basis of cognition and language, if we can find that we can do this via multiple exemplar training that we are using every day as practitioners, that's pretty exciting. So that kind of brings us on to some previous research. So we know from previous research, and I have rather terribly included my own research in there, that particular relational repertoires do increase as a function of age. As behavior analysts, we're sitting here thinking, yes, because of behavioral history, and we have more opportunities to get reinforcement for those particular repertoires. And kind of what relational frame theorists would say as well. And there is some evidence to state that equivalence emerges at a young age. So Lipkins back in 1993 found that essentially stimulus equivalence seems to emerge at the same time as what a lot of developmental psychologists would say is the language burst. So we have a lot of evidence on that. Arguably, that's probably why we teach so much stimulus equivalence on the behavior analyst task list. But we don't have a lot of evidence in terms of the additional relational repertoires, because relational frame theory goes past stimulus equivalence, and it understands that our language is more than just saying like a, despite what a lot of American TV shows would have you believe. We can also look at analogical reasoning, and we can conceptualize that as being relating relations, which sounds really abstract in and of itself, which makes sense because it is an abstract ability. But when we look at analogies, they are things like apples are to oranges as cats are to dogs. We have two different relationships there of an apple is the same as an orange, and then we have cats are the same as dogs, although if you're a cat dog lover you will argue that. And then we are also putting them in a relationship of sameness of this group one of stimuli of apples and oranges as being the same as cats and dogs. So that is relating relations. We are finding the relationships between those relationships. So it's like this extra order of like really complex relations. And there hasn't been a lot of research done on that, which in itself is interesting, because if anyone looks at cognitive psychology, that's a lot of what they're interested in. When you look at a lot of standardized assessments on IQ, that's some of the higher order things that they're looking at. And if we can come in as behavior analysts and potentially have a framework for teaching this level of responding, that's pretty cool. But there is debate as to what age analogical reasoning occurs. Goswami and Brown in 1989 outlined that children as young as 3 can engage in these tasks, while earlier research suggested that this repertoire emerged at the age of 12. Now, this depends very much on the complexity of the analogies that we're putting forward. And again, relational frame theorists would say, well, are we looking at arbitrary relations, or are we looking at those non-arbitrary things of, you know, can we see the relationships between those stimuli? And that is quite an important question. And that's a lot of what Elle and Ian's research actually looks at, is looking at that relationship between that non-arbitrary and the arbitrary level of responding and determining the age at which these repertoires occur. So pretty nice for us as practitioners to know. So Barnes in 1997 outlined that analogy could be conceptualized as equivalence responding. That's what a lot of the RFT research would consider it to be. And they tested and trained 4 3-member equivalence relations in adults and 9-year-olds using a match to sample procedure. And following their research, all participants related equivalence relations to other equivalence relations and non-equivalence relations to other non-equivalence relations. So they had a basic model of analogical reasoning. So already, way back to 1997, we are showing that behavior analysis and RFT has the means to potentially teach these particular skills. And Carpentier in 2002 found that only 2 of the 18 5-year-olds exposed to training acquired analogical relational responding repertoires. And this comes back to what I said earlier of the non-arbitrary relations being the building blocks. What you often need to do is look to see if those non-arbitrary skills are there. There was a fabulous paper done by Behrens and Hayes in 2007 teaching comparative relations, and they tried to teach arbitrary comparative relations and found it didn't work until they went and taught non-arbitrary. So again, what we really need to do is find this assessment method to determine where our clients are at in terms of these skills to teach them. So this is what Elle and Ian have done. They have looked to try and find an assessment method to do this. And they had 24 students, 14 females, 10 males in a private school in New Jersey, aged between 36 and 84 months. So they were getting 3 to 7-year-olds involved in this research. They tested IQ using the Stanford BNA 5th edition. Part of why they did that is a lot of the RFT research uses that. Laura Moran used it in her research. I used it in my research. So we wanted to have, I suppose, parity so that we can compare across these studies. And they also formulated their own relational assessment. And there are 4 stages to these. So the first one is non-arbitrary relations. So again, it's relating those stimuli based upon those formal characteristics. So she had things like sameness, so understanding that yellow is the same as yellow, opposition, that black is opposite to white, temporality, that one square turned up on the page before the other one. So she had quite a few relations in the mix. And then there was non-arbitrary analogical relations. So again, this is coming back to our argument of, well, all of these different research is finding that analogical reasoning is happening at different ages. Could it be that the questions that we're asking are arbitrary versus non-arbitrary? So her research was looking at the non-arbitrariness of these analogical relations. So again, kind of going red is to red as blue is to blank should be blue, so that we could see those particular things. And then stage 3 is arbitrary relations. So looking at the same types of relational frames, sameness, opposition, temporality, hierarchy, but now looking at it from a more abstract sense. So looking at relating stimuli that they have never had any exposure to before. And then finally, arbitrary analogical relations. So quite a comprehensive test, and I've gotten my little paws on it, and it's very nice. It's a lot of fun to play with. Each stage had 5 substages, including coordination, comparison, opposition, temporality, and hierarchy. And this was partly because this is where the bulk of the research has kind of gone in the past. So Elle was using stuff that already existed. My research had looked at hierarchy. If we look at coordination, comparison, and opposition, Sarah Cassidy has done an awful lot of research on that. If you look at SMART training, that looks at coordination, comparison, and opposition. Temporality has been looked at by Dennis O'Hora. So she was taking stuff that had already existed and had already been tested and was just extending the research to try and determine the relationship between age and this particular skill. So we could get a normative development and then a determination of how these skills are related to intellectual functioning. And this is what it actually looked like. This is ARA stage 1, which is what it's known as, the ARA, the Arbitrary Relational Assessment. So if we look there, you'll see the very top is, say, a circle, and then at the very bottom, then you can see a circle, a diamond, and a triangle. And children were asked to find what was the same as the one on top. So they would then select the circle. So you can see this is all based upon the formal characteristics of the stimuli, that they are the same as. And again, you had things with opposition of, they were shown length, they were shown color, temporality, it was using the fun functions of PowerPoint to get certain shapes to whiz in at certain times. And then hierarchy was all about containment, because from my research, we found that containment was a part of hierarchy. So that's what the testing actually looked like, and it was all done via Keynote PowerPoint. Then non-arbitrary, again, we can see they were given the first part of the relationship. Yes.
So before you go into the non-arbitrary, just to give the first keyword, it's analogical. The first keyword is analogical. Thank you.
Excellent. Makes sense considering the topic. So then you can kind of see when they go onto the non-arbitrary analogical relations, if you look at the very first slide of the green circles, the children were then presented with the 2 options below and to find something that was the same. So again, they are relating those relations of the green circle to the green circle as the green square is to the green square. So they did that across all of those relations, across comparison, opposition, temporality, and hierarchy. And you can kind of see that on the slide. So hopefully it helps to kind of visualize what the actual experiment looked like. I think a really nice strength of this ARA is it requires a minimal tools. It's a lot of the stuff that we have as practitioners on the ground. You don't need a lot of resources for this particular one. And then stage 3 was the arbitrary relations. And what she did, which I thought was really good, was she had actually inserted a little button that the kids could press on the PowerPoint to let them know what the S stood for. So S is same as. And they were able to play that as many times as they wanted. So again, you can kind of see she had mixed in coordination and distinction, comparison, opposition. And again, you can kind of see, you can't tell that there's a relationship between these particular stimuli based upon the formal characteristics of them. Green is not physically the same as orange, but she was putting down that green square was the same as the orange square. And if you have arbitrary coordination, you could then derive that the orange square is the same as the green square. So that was what stage 3 looked like. And then the very final stage was the arbitrary analogical relations. So that's the really tricky stuff. Like I said, this is stuff that if you looked at the Stanford BNA and you looked at the verbal IQ portion, this is what it looks at, is that analogical reasoning. So she had put up those particular relationships there, and you had to try and determine the correct response. So very, very tricky. And again, she had those little buttons that you could press to let you know what the relationship was. So it wasn't a necessity that kids had to know that S stood for same. There was a little button. So again, there was no prerequisite in terms of kids being able to read things. That was, I think, quite a clever little way around that. But that's what that stage of testing actually looked like. And then when we get to the results, we see this really quite clear relationship between the ARA total score, so kids responding across all 4 stages, and its relationship with their raw score on the Stanford BNA 5. So that's the test of IQ. So we can see there's quite a strong positive relationship there, that as one goes up, the other one goes up. And I'm having flashbacks of teaching correlation to my undergraduate students. But this is quite a nice example of quite a clear positive relationship. And then when we look at ARA total score and age, we can also see there's quite a strong relationship there as well. As behavioral psychologists, we can say, yes, probably what's happening there is increased exposure to these particular contingencies and lots of feedback and reinforcement for these particular responses. So that's the results on that. And again, they have this lovely normative data that tells us, well, when are these things actually emerging? And if we look at that stage 1 stuff, so the non-arbitrary relations, unsurprisingly, the first thing that we see that seems to emerge, coordination, sameness, stimulus equivalence. That's kind of what we would have expected. Verbs are hard today. Lipkins would have found that back in 1993, and a lot of other research has kind of supported that. But again, always nice to have replication in psychology. Then we see that comparison is the second thing to come out. Then, interestingly, hierarchy. Opposition comes next, and then temporality. Stage 2 then is the non-arbitrary analogical reasoning. Again, we're seeing a similar pattern here. Coordination is coming out first, followed interestingly by hierarchy, then comparison, temporality, and opposition. So these are like RFT kicked up a notch. That's a really hard level of non-arbitrary responding. And then when we look at the arbitrary responding, that's the stuff that we really like as relational frame theorists, because that's the real key to generative language. Again, we're seeing coordination comes out first. And then the next thing that we're looking at is opposition. which I find very interesting because that comes out second in stage 3, but it comes out as fourth in stage 1. So some of the rationale behind why the arbitrary opposition comes out before the non-arbitrary opposition is that in reality, when we are teaching opposition to the tiny humans, we often aren't actually teaching them using formal characteristics. We actually tend to teach these things via intraverbals. Look at a lot of our own teaching. We say that short is opposite to tall. We often aren't using very formal characteristic programs. So this is actually a really important thing to note, because actually some of the research has found, I'm getting ahead of myself, that non-arbitrary opposition is actually quite linked to IQ. So that may be something that we really need to start plugging into our educational curriculum as behavior analysts. I'm very excited about this, so bear with me. And then finally, when we're looking at stage 4, the arbitrary analogical relational responding, again, coordination is coming out first. So I think, just based upon this and just based upon our general understanding of behavior, it kind of makes sense that a lot of our current curriculums do look at sameness. You look at the VB map, you look at the ABLs, a lot of that is focused on match to sample and that firm basis of sameness. So it's not a case of like, let's throw this out. Actually, that coordination is actually very important. But now we're getting that extra information about all of these other frames and when they seem to emerge. So it's letting us understand when we should be plugging these things into our training. So for me, I find that quite interesting. So again, this is a really nice little, I like graphs. We all like graphs. We're behavior analysts. We like to look at these things in this way. So again, this does seem to tell us coordination seems to be the first thing to come out across all stages. And then there's some amount of variability then in terms of the other relational frames. But if we are working as practitioners, we should always be looking to teach coordination first and then considering the rest later. So again, this is just another little slide on that. So when we're looking at the results, we can see that there's improvement in responding across cohorts. So that essentially means that the older the participant, the better they get at this sort of responding. Again, behavior analysts were saying, yeah, because they're getting more exposure to these particular things. There was very little variation in coordination performance. They were varying between 98 to 100% correct. And we would kind of expect that because we were looking at, or well, I say we, I had nothing to do with this. I'm just talking about their research. But they were looking at neurotypical kids from the age of 3 to 7. So they already had the basis of language. So it would make sense that they would have quite strong coordination responses. The research found that as age increased, comparative and hierarchical responding improved, particularly between the 4 to 5-year-olds and the 5 to 6-year-old group, because the real jump in responding seems to happen at about that age. And again, any of us who have any idea about what happens with tiny humans at that stage, it's, well, they're going into education. They're having much more exposure to these particular contingencies. That's what's happening. All age cohorts showed the lowest performance on temporality and opposition, but performance gradually increases across all cohorts. And again, if you look at the actual educational curriculum across lots of different countries, teaching temporality, things like time, that doesn't occur until much later. You don't really tend to teach that to 4 and 5-year-olds. So around about the age of 7, they start to look at these things. So again, as behaviorists, we're looking at this and kind of saying, well, yeah, it's what's going on in their environment. And again, opposition, that doesn't get taught to 4-year-olds straight away. That's something that gets taught later on. Then when we look at stages 2, 3, and 4, again, we're seeing that the performance across all of these relational frames improves with age, or as I like to think of it, exposure. We're not a Piaget here, just thinking that these skills just miraculously occur due to maturation. It's down to our exposure to these things. With stage 3, there is a very clear increase in relational performance between the 3 to 4-year-olds and the 4 to 5-year-olds. And again, That's partly the language burst is happening at that particular point. They're starting to get more exposure to those arbitrary contingencies from parents, from caregivers. They're getting more exposure in daycare, creches, whatever you want to call them. Stage 4 relational responding is lowest in the 3 to 4-year-olds and the 4 to 5-year-old group. So that is the arbitrary analogical reasoning. That's kind of what we would expect, but that goes against some of the earlier research that said that some kids as early as 3 struggle with that. But we know that kids can engage in the non-arbitrary analogical reasoning at that age group. So potentially that was what that research was doing. They were looking at the non-arbitrary analogy rather than the arbitrary analogy. Improvement on that arbitrary analogy starts to occur from ages 5 to 6, particularly in relation to coordinate analogy. Because again, if we look back at like which one comes out first, it's coordination and sameness. So if you want to teach an analogical reasoning to your tiny humans, start off with those coordination responses. That makes the most sense. And that improvement on stage 4 continues in the 6 to 7-year-old group across all analogical frames. Now, unfortunately, the research stops at 7-year-olds. I'm a nosy bee and wish there had been more that I could look until they were 12, because, Carpentier et al. Study is saying, oh, some of this analogical reasoning doesn't occur or doesn't fully emerge until the age of 12. So that's, for me, a limitation, is just looking at those particular age groups. But one of the big things around this particular research paper, and why I chose to talk about this, is it does offer additional evidence that AADRR is an operant associated with human language and cognition. In previous research, again, horrible plug for my own research, we found that arbitrarily applicable hierarchical relational framing was actually associated with language as measured via the PPVT. So that's, can't even remember what that stands for now, but just know that it's a standardized measurement of language.
Peabody, picture vocabulary, Peabody,
That's the
picture
one,
vocabulary.
Peabody. Yeah, sorry, I'm having flashbacks to my Viva now. It's all fine. But it does also offer us some indication of the normative development of relational responding and its sequence. And for us, that's really important. A lot of what we do is basing our teaching on curriculums like the ABLES, the VB map, and that tells us we go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. This is giving us some sort of an indication of the normative development so that we're not putting the cart before the horse. And what I like about this is an assessment that can kind of go across countries. So there aren't any particular cultural references for anyone who's looked at things like the peak. I'm not saying anything against the peak, but there are some very American kind of phrases or pieces in there that may not link into Ireland. There's some questions around tornadoes, and if I asked a 3-year-old in Ireland what a tornado was, they'd be very confused. So I think what's good about this particular assessment is it kind of gets rid of any particular cultural divides. The non-arbitrary comparison was the only non-arbitrary relation that showed significant correlations with age, IQ score, total ARA score, and the overall ARA score for each of the stages. And that suggests that non-arbitrary comparative relations may be important for intellectual potential, the emergence of our arbitrary relational framing, and analogical responding. But again, if we look at the way that we've been teaching these particular skills, we generally tend to teach them verbally through intraverbals. Johnny is taller than Sarah. I have more than you have. So maybe we need to think more about the formal characteristics and go back into teaching those non-arbitrary relations to a really solid point. General thought or food for thought there.
So could you elaborate a bit on this? So what would you expect it to look like when we do that type of training?
Okay, so if we looked at, I mean, the issue with looking at comparison is it's not just a thing of bigger than, smaller than, it's more than, less than, whiter than, blacker than. There's any number of comparative frames. So you'd have to think about which ones obviously are going to make the most sense for the kid that you're working with, but make sure that they're meaningful. So the easiest ways to be looking at that may be more than, less than. Tiny humans are very concerned with who's getting more and who's getting less in terms of, biscuits. You could do that in terms of who has more toys, who has more socks. So does this pile have more socks? Does this pile have more socks? So again, use that natural environment training to do these particular things. Does this cup have more water? Does this cup have less water? So things like that. But again, like I'm saying, comparison is a tricky one because there's any number of almost subframes in that of, when we're comparing these particular things. So it's just thinking about the ones that would make the most sense. Again, if we're thinking about longer versus shorter, you could use string, wool, shirt sleeves. Are my shirt sleeves longer than your shirt sleeves? So thinking about that in that non-arbitrary sense. And again, try and use as much natural environment training as possible. There's loads of opportunities for that, so why not embrace it?
So I might be oversimplifying this, and apologies beforehand if that's the case. But I suppose then one suggestion for clinicians and teachers and so on would be to try to visualize this training in some way for the kiddos. Is that a like a simple way to explain it to someone when we're talking about what you're saying in terms of don't only rely on language to train those relational frames? Do I get it? Am I getting it?
Absolutely. So it's basically teaching, well, what is bigger? What does that word actually mean? What does bigger look like? And we need to really have those very strong physical cues in there to teach the tiny humans what bigger means, because it's an abstract idea. I mean, I don't know about you, but I can't even conceptualize what billions looks like because I've never seen it. I'd love to see it, but I haven't seen it. But again, that's probably my issue around non-arbitrary relational responding. But if we try and figure out how best to visualize these things and bring these things to bear, it'll make it a lot easier on kids when we're teaching these things, because we do teach an awful lot of abstract thinking and responding. So the more we can ground it in things that are firm for them, it'll be a bit easier. I know that sounds very cognitive. I'm very sorry. I've been hanging out with some cognitive psychologists lately.
No, that's all right.
Bridging the gap.
We are an accepting bunch here.
Bridging the gap, so to speak. We won't let Chomsky put us off completely.
Just to say that the second keyword is visualize. The second keyword is visualize.
Fab. So the data showed that scores were lowest for temporal relations. So that's before, after, across all of the age cohorts. Again, that makes an awful lot of sense when we're looking at how curriculums are actually focused, and how many times in our day do we talk about before or after. If we were to do a quick look at the types of relational frames that we are using every day, we use an awful lot of coordinate relations where we're saying, oh, it's like this, or it's not like this, difference. We're using a bit of opposition. We sometimes use comparison, but we don't use an awful lot of temporality in our everyday lives. So a lot of the issue around this seems to be a lack of exposure to these particular relational frames. So again, we can't just think that these things miraculously occur. We will actually have to sit down and think about how to train these particular things. But unfortunately, there's an absolute dearth of literature in terms of temporality relations. The only one I can really think of is Dennis O'Hora, and that was done when I think I was still an undergraduate, and I'm older than I look. So, that says something. So it does suggest that temporal relations are actually acquired after the other tested frames, which is interesting because we would think that things like hierarchy, that understanding of a bird is a type of an animal would be more difficult than 5 comes after 4. But it seems that that's the way that these things are developing based upon this particular data. So with the exception of that oppositional relational responding, participants performed better on the non-arbitrary stuff than the arbitrary stuff. Again, that makes sense. We have to teach the people that we're working with to walk before they can run. If we don't understand what the concept of bigger than is, how can we understand it when we're faced with arbitrary stimuli like a vlorg? If you didn't know what the word like was, and I said vlorg, comma, dog, you wouldn't understand what the relationship was between those particular things. So teaching those particular contextual cues, we have to do that via non-arbitrary relations. Hopefully that makes sense and that I'm not rambling too much. It does show that there's potential for integration with existing assessment protocols and curriculums. It's not a case of, oh, throw out the VB map and throw out the ABLs, but this could be a very nice augmentative protocol for checking these things. As you could kind of see there when I was showing you some of the samples from it, this is all stuff that we have as practitioners. We all hopefully have we're all here, we all have laptops, or at least a phone that we could potentially test these particular frames with our clients. So it's not that we're having to go off and buy any additional tools, but we could link that in with our existing things around the VB map and potentially augment things, because the VB map really does consider things like coordinate responses. But if we were to go through things in terms of, say, how much temporality is actually taught on the VB map, I can't think of any stage within the VB map or any substage that actually looks at temporality. So this could be something that looks at that. Of course, one of the limitations, I do feel a bit like an undergrad saying this, representativeness of the sample, small sample size. I'm just after correcting a lot of exam papers, so it's like the favorite thing of students to say is a small sample size, but this was quite small, 24 students, but of course this is all down to resources. This is a PhD student doing her research, and this is fairly time intensive for anyone who has done the SB5. That in itself takes a period of time to actually conduct, usually about 2 sittings. And then you could see all of the stages. There were 4 stages with quite a few questions beneath. And if you're working with little 3-year-olds, we have to make sure that their attention is actually there for that period of time. So again, that's probably why there was only 24 participants. Interestingly, when we looked at, when they looked at the mean IQ of the students, it was about 112, which is actually above the average IQ. So again, that's a possibility that it wasn't entirely representative of the sample. We're also looking at kids from a private school in New Jersey. So different standard of education could have potentially looked different if there are kids from rural Ireland. Saying that because I'm currently in rural Ireland. Rural is very hard to say, a lot of rolling R's. But it does advance on a lot of our previous research on analogy, because there isn't a lot of that in applied behavior analysis or RFT in general. And this is something that cognitive psychologists have been looking at for a long time. So it makes sense that we maybe potentially pull up a chair at this particular conversation, because we do potentially have something to offer here. Because as we said, like this research does show us that these skills are operants, i.e. we can teach these via contingencies of reinforcement. And we now have data to tell us about the normative development. So it's on us to potentially go from there. And that's it. That's the kit and caboodle.
Thank you very, very much. We've got a question. One of the attendees says, I guess the comparison relation is the first one learned, where the adjective changes according to which way you're describing the relationship, for example, bigger versus smaller, a sort of precursor to deictic, if I'm reading the word right, deictic relations.
Yeah, so dialectic relations.
Dialectic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa.
Look, I'll be honest, you know, I take pronunciations with a pinch of salt. I was just reading those words for a long time and not knowing. I only know how to pronounce this from Ian Stewart, so, and Louise McHugh, who does a lot of research on dialectic frames. So dialectic relational frames is perspective taking, essentially. So it would view perspective taking, which is, by the way, a really, really tricky relational frame. I did do a project with a former student of mine on that, but we would look at perspective taking as being understanding the relationship between I, you, here, there, and now, then. So really, really tricky. And Louise McHugh has done an awful lot of research on that. So there was actually a book published by herself and Ian, I want to say about 2 years ago, that offers a really, really nice summation of the research on that. But yeah, you could look at that as being kind of the emergence of that comparing of I versus you. There's definitely something in there. And look, relational frame theory is still so new. If we look at the original purple book that a lot of us have not had to read, that sounded very like gun pointed in the forehead. We didn't have to read it, it was a choice. That was published back in 2001. So we're only 20 years on, we're still learning stuff, and there's still a lot of relational frames that haven't been looked at. So I get excited when I think about it because there's just so much research that can be done. So yeah, a very long-winded answer.
No, that's great, and thank you for that. If you guys have questions, either you can use the chat or the Q&A. And as I'm waiting to see if there are any additional questions, Teresa, could you tell us some suggestions in terms of curricula then? So, you know, people who might be teachers or behavior analysts or speech and language therapists, where would they start? Like, what would you suggest is a good curriculum in terms of covering as many, I suppose, frames as possible?
I mean, if we're talking about established curriculums that are already existing, the peak is quite good. Now, depending upon where you are in the globe, you may have to change around some of the questions. But interestingly enough, I think if you look at a lot of research like this, you can actually figure out how to tailor things yourself. Now, in Elle's research, she actually, in the appendix, has all of the stimuli that she used. So it's just a matter of putting that together and putting it into a PowerPoint, and you can assess it, but then you can also train it in that same way, but just plug in different stimuli. So rather than always putting in a green circle, you could put in a red square, find something that's the same. It requires a certain amount of thinking, but if we really want to make sure we have generative responding, the onus is often on us to actually come up with our own materials, which I know is like really annoying, but it's quite good. I would also say that if you are working with kids that already have an established non-arbitrary repertoire, that SMART training is quite good, because they don't explicitly state it, but there's definitely an integration of precision teaching with RFT on that curriculum, because you have a countdown in terms of how fast you have to respond, and each stage kind of builds upon the previous one in terms of its complexity, and it goes through a number of the relational frames, but at an arbitrary level. So you'd have to make sure that the non-arbitrary stuff was done first, but that's quite nice because it's done in a gamified way. I actually used that in a study that we published recently with some tiny humans, and over a 6-week period, we found that their IQ increased on average 9.8 points. And it also increased their math and English scores on their Drumcondra, which is an Irish standardized test of educational attainment. So the school was quite happy with us after 6 weeks to have that much of a thing, but that's already available. You can have free trials of that for up to a week. So I would recommend that if you have the non-arbitrary relations down. But for the non-arbitrary stuff, just plug in your own things. I know that Dermot Barnes-Holmes has also made the IRAP, which I know we often look at that as being, this is, by the way, the implicit relational assessment procedure. We would look at that as being something that tests implicit cognitions, but that can actually be changed to actually make selections on sameness of responses. And at the Division of Behavior Analysis, I want to say about 4 years ago, he actually gave out the software for the Go IRAP, which was to be for practitioners. So I'm sure if you contacted, I'm just offering this from him. I'm sure if you actually contacted him, he'd happily share that. And you can plug in any number of stimuli. You just have to link it in with a folder on your desktop, and it'll plug in particular stimuli for you, so you could have it on an iPad, on a laptop, whatever it is that you want there. And of course, Siri Ming has quite a few things on that. So the TARPA, the training and assessment of relational procedures. So if you look at that, she also can make that available to some people as well. So there's a couple of different ways to get around that, depending upon the resources that you have. Long answer.
No, that's great. That's what we want. We want to get as much info as we can, and thank you for that. Okay, the last keyword is going to be book. The last keyword is going to be book. The second one was visualize. I know a couple of you didn't hear it. The second one was visualize. The third one is book. And with that, Teresa, could you tell us what the title is going to be so that people can keep an eye out for it when it comes out in those couple of months?
It's a very innovative title. Relational Frame Theory Made Simple.
Okay, and it's going to be by Springer.
Yes, yes.
Okay, Relational Frame Theory Made Simple by Springer and by Teresa Mulhern.
Yes.
Thank you ever so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
No, it's been great, and we would love to host you again to talk more about your research and how the field is progressing. I think it's really good to see RFT growing. It's funny because I think that it's one of these things with our field. We didn't realize that Skinner always talked about these things, but people just didn't look into them.
Yeah.
So, you know, when people worry whether it's behavioral enough, yes, it is. You know, if you understand radical behaviorism, it's completely in line with that. There is no difference really. It's just that people are actually doing these things and are looking into them now experimentally, which is it's really great. Let me see. I think we might have one more question. No? Okay, that's fine. All right. Thank you ever so much, Teresa. So the keywords, I'll say them one more time because I know people miss them: analogical, visualize, and book. Teresa, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for having me.
I will definitely chase you up for another journal club in the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Enjoy,
Thank you
guys.